Alright, so for our presentation, we chose to do it on the link between the herpes virus and the Alzheimer's disorder. Okay, so what is Alzheimer's? Alzheimer's is an irreversible, progressive, degenerative disorder of the brain that the patients tend to eventually end up losing their memory. They end up losing um, they end up losing the inability to carry out simple tasks, and it's eventually fatal. There's no cure for Alzheimer's at this point.
So the herpes simplex virus 1 is commonly characterized by sores around the mouth and can eventually lead to brain damage if it passes the blood-brain barrier. There's no cure. It's spread by kissing, sharing objects like toothbrushes, eating utensils, and it establishes lifelong latent infections in up to about 90% of the world population.
Now, for our social media article, we found one that was published by the Times Magazine last 2016, actually, and it stated that there was a team of 31 scientists that were trying to make it known to the people with herpes that, hey, you're at risk for eventually developing Alzheimer's, because the damage that the herpes virus had on the central nervous system as well as the limbic system was very similar to the damage that was shown as a preliminary step in the progress of Alzheimer's disorder.
So why is this connection being made? The herpes virus has long been suspected to play a role in the an etiological role in the development of Alzheimer's disease. According to a 2014 study, this is due to the virus's neurotropism, high rate of infection in the general population, lifelong persistence in neuronal cells, and particularly in the same brain regions that are usually altered in Alzheimer's disease. It's hypothesized that as the immune system weakens in later life, the herpes virus spreads, and either through the trigeminal nerves, or the meninges. No, to the meninges or via the olfactory tract. And this leads to inflammation and cellular changes promoting amyloid beta production and other changes leading to Alzheimer's disease.
Now, with the herpes simplex infection, there was a study back in 2015 where there was plasma samples taken from 360 patients with Alzheimer's disorder, and had a mean age about 61 years old, and then there was another 360 people with matching dementia free controls. Their plasmas were they were tested to see if there was any anti-human herpes simplex virus antibodies within their cerebrospinal fluids, and people with it showed there was a follow-up time. So they took the initial plasma samples, and then after a while they took more plasma samples to compare to their initial ones to see how whether there were more antibodies within their system, and if if they had either developed Alzheimer's or if their Alzheimer's had progressed even worse. And it showed that those that had a follow-up on average of 6 to 7 years after the initial plasma sample was taken, they were at more risk to having developed Alzheimer's.
So another study done in 2014 showed the relation with the virus and the progression of Alzheimer's disease. There's different viruses in the herpes virus family, and so this study tested EBV, HHV6, and CMV, and they took brain samples, and the presence of these viruses were actually shown to support the notion of persistent cycles of latency and reactivation phases. So it contributed to the stress of systemic immune response, inducing altered inflammatory processes that in turn result in the cognitive decline and deterioration that are symptoms of Alzheimer's disease.
Now, in the cases where there was reactivation of the herpes virus, there was a tendency for there to be a higher risk for the patients to eventually develop Alzheimer's. And this study was conducted again back in 2015, where there was over 3,400 people with herpes. Yeah, over 3,400 people with herpes were conducted in this study, and the number of incidences where there was Alzheimer's disorder was 245, and it was shown that the presence of the herpes simplex virus, IgG antibodies, it was not associated with the increased risk for Alzheimer's, but if they had the antibodies for the anti-HSV IgM virus, then they were at higher risk for developing Alzheimer's disorder. And the positivity for anti-HSV IgM antibodies was a sign of a reactivated infection, and it was almost found to double the risk for Alzheimer's.
So in conclusions, all these studies basically show an association between herpes virus and Alzheimer's disease. The herpes virus does cross the blood-brain barrier and begins to affect your cognitive abilities, especially after the virus has reactivated, as it was shown in the last two studies we discussed. Though the studies were tested through brain samples, they do need to be replicated in larger scales to further be better interpreted. But thus far, it has been shown that the herpes virus does have a somewhat serious correlation to the deterioration that begins to occur and accompany Alzheimer's disease.
And that's it?